stand up there in the pulpit and you say, I will teach you infinities. I will say to you that the greatest poem in the English language is the present tense of the verb to be. Now, one asks, what is the present tense of the verb to be? Now, I'll speak it for you, right? It was like this. The present indicative of the verb to be. I am, thou art, she is, he is, we are, you are, they are.
Мне кажется порой, что солдаты с кровавых не пришедшие полей не в землю нашу полегли когда-то, превратились в белых журавлей. Они до сей поры со времен тех давних летят и подают нам голоса. Не потому так часто и печально мы замолкаем, глядя в небеса. Летит, летит по небу клин усталый, летит в тумане на исходе дня. И в том строю есть промежуток малый. Быть может, это место для меня настанет день из журавлиной стаи. Я поплыву в такой же сизой мгле, из-под небес по птичьи окликая всех вас, кого оставил на земле. Мне кажется порой, что солдаты с кровавых и пришедшие полей. И в землю нашу полегли когда-то, а превратились в белых журавлей.
Welcome everyone to Season 3, Episode 3 of Conversations with the Wind. I hope everyone is all right and spending their time wisely. Please be safe and creative out there. Before we begin with this episode, I would like to make a few important announcements. Passage Prize is a literature and arts contest with a $20,000 prize pool, which will be awarded to winning entries in the categories of fiction, poetry, visual art, and literary nonfiction. Winning submissions will be collected in a physical and digital volume to be published by Passage Press in partnership with Canonic. Entrants are encouraged to review the guidelines and prize details before submitting, as well as the editor's note on their website. The deadline is January 1, 2022. Please visit passageprize.com for more information. Don't forget that submissions for the 4th annual Memeing of a White Christmas compilation are due by Thursday, December 16 at 11:59 p.m. EST. Please visit the White Art Collective's website, whiteartcollective.com, for more information. The song you just heard is titled Cranes by the Moscow Military District Ensemble. Cranes, or Zhuvrali, was first performed in 1969 and is considered one of the most famous Russian songs about World War II. Dagestani poet Razul Gamzatov visited Hiroshima and was inspired by a monument to Sadako Sasaki, a Japanese girl who died of leukemia as a result of radioactive nuclear fallout. According to Japanese tradition, she constructed 1,000 paper cranes, hoping in vain that this might save her life. Since then, this poem and song have become symbols of fallen soldiers and innocent victims of World War II. This song was recorded in 1973. In this episode, I would like to focus on anti-communist literature with a special emphasis on the great Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Only a breath separates our interpretation of famous literary figures and how these artists may have perceived themselves. This image is often quite different from contemporary assumptions. Anti-communist writers throughout the Eastern Bloc and Russia represented a wide array of thoughts, values, and ideologies. There were reformed socialists, nationalists, Christian traditionalists, and even liberals of various persuasions. They may have shared a struggle against communism, but that's where it ended. Alexander Solzhenitsyn stands out as a man ahead of his time, a man who understood how identity, morality, and faith were the foundations of any future civilizational consideration. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970 and lauded by many scholars in the West. That is, until he shared his truth with those who wanted to project their values upon him. In 1978, he received an honorary degree from Harvard University. On June 8, 1978, Solzhenitsyn gave a commencement address where he condemned the media, the lack of spiritual and traditional values, and the anthropocentrism of Western culture. When Solzhenitsyn speaks of the West, we must understand this as a condemnation of the values, and not the people. This speech is the answer to those who currently proclaim to represent a twisted idea of Western values. Without further ado, I would like to read A World Split Apart by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The following reading is from the Harper & Row Publishers print from 1978. A World Split Apart. I am sincerely happy to be here with you on the occasion of the 327th commencement of this old and illustrious university. My congratulations and best wishes to all of today's graduates. Harvard's motto is Veritas. Many of you have already found out, and others will find out in the course of their lives, that truth eludes us as soon as our concentration begins to flag, all the while leaving the illusion that we are continuing to pursue it. This is the source of much discord. Although truth seldom is sweet, it is almost invariably bitter. A measure of truth is included in my speech today, but I offer it as a friend, not as an adversary. 3 years ago in the United States, I said certain things that were rejected and appeared unacceptable. Today, however, many people agree with what I said. The split in today's world is perceptible even to a hasty glance. Any of our contemporaries readily identifies two world powers, each of them already capable of destroying each other. However, the understanding of the split too often is limited to this political conception, the illusion according to which danger may be abolished through successful diplomatic negotiations or by achieving a balance of armed forces. The truth is that the split is both more profound and more alienating, that the rifts are more numerous than one can see at first glance. These deep manifold splits bear the danger of equally manifold disaster for all of us, in accordance with the ancient truth that a kingdom, in this case our earth, divided against itself cannot stand. There is the concept of the third world. Thus we already have 3 worlds. Undoubtedly, however, the number is even greater. We are just too far away to see. Every ancient and deeply rooted self-contained culture, especially if it is spread over a wide part of the Earth's surface, constitutes a self-contained world, full of riddles and surprises to Western thinking. As a minimum, we must include in this China, India, the Muslim world, and Africa, if indeed we accept the approximation of viewing the latter two as uniform. For 1,000 years, Russia belonged to such a category, although Western thinking systematically committed the mistake of denying its special character, and therefore never understood it, just as today the West does not understand Russia in communist captivity. And while it may be that in past years Japan has increasingly become, in effect, a far West, drawing ever closer to Western ways, I am no judge here, Israel, I think, should not be reckoned as part of the West, if only because of the decisive circumstance that its state system is fundamentally linked to its religion. How short a time ago, relatively, the small world of modern Europe was easily seizing colonies all over the globe, not only without anticipating any real resistance, but usually with contempt for any possible values in the conquered people's approach to life. It all seemed an overwhelming success, with no geographic limits. Western society expanded in a triumph of human independence and power, and all of a sudden the 20th century brought the clear realization of this society's fragility. We now see that the conquests proved to be short-lived and precarious, and this in turn points to defects in the Western view of the world which led to these conquests. Relations with the former colonial world now have switched to the opposite extreme, and the Western world often exhibits an excess of obsequiousness, but it is difficult yet to estimate the size of the bill which former colonial countries will present to the West, and it is difficult to predict whether the surrender, not only of its last colonies, but of everything it owns, will be sufficient for the West to clear this account. But the persisting blindness of superiority continues to hold the belief that all the vast regions of our planet should develop and mature to the level of contemporary Western systems. The best in theory and the most attractive in practice, that all those other worlds are but temporarily prevented by wicked leaders or by severe crises or by their own barbarity and incomprehension from pursuing Western pluralistic democracy and adopting the Western way of life. Countries are judged on the merit of their progress in that direction. But in fact, such a conception is a fruit of the Western incomprehension of the essence of other worlds, a result of mistakenly measuring them all with a Western yardstick. The real picture of our planet's development bears little resemblance to all this. The anguish of a divided world gave birth to the theory of convergence between the leading Western countries and the Soviet Union. It is a soothing theory which overlooks the fact that these worlds are not evolving toward each other, and that neither one can be transformed into the other without violence. Besides, convergence inevitably means acceptance of the other side's defects, too, and this can hardly suit anyone. If I were today addressing an audience in my country, in my examination of the overall pattern of the world's rifts, I would have concentrated on the calamities of the East. But since my forced exile in the West has now lasted 4 years, and since my audience is a Western one, I think it may be of greater interest to concentrate on certain aspects of the contemporary West, such as I see them. A decline in courage may be the most striking feature that an outside observer notices in the West today. The Western world has lost its civic courage, both as a whole and separately, in each country, in each government, in each political party, and, of course, in the United Nations. Such a decline in courage is particularly noticeable among the ruling and intellectual elites, causing an impression of a loss of courage by the entire society. There are many courageous individuals, but they have no determining influence on public life. Political and intellectual functionaries exhibit this depression, passivity, and perplexity in their actions and in their statements, and even more so in their self-serving rationales as to how realistic, reasonable, and intellectually and even morally justified it is to base state policies on weakness and cowardice. And the decline in courage, at times attaining what could be termed a lack of manhood, is ironically emphasized by occasional outbursts and inflexibility on the part of those same functionaries when dealing with weak governments and with countries that lack support, or with doomed currents which clearly cannot offer resistance. But they get tongue-tied and paralyzed when they deal with powerful governments and threatening forces, with aggressors and international terrorists. Must one point out that from ancient times, a decline in courage has been considered the first symptom of the end? When most Western states were being formed, it was proclaimed as a principle that governments are meant to serve man, and that man lives in order to be free and pursue happiness. See, for example, the American Declaration of Independence. Now at last, during past decades, technical and social progress has permitted the realization of such aspirations, the welfare state. Every citizen has been granted the desired freedom and material goods in such quantity and in such quality as to guarantee in theory the achievement of happiness, in the debased sense of the word which has come into being during those same decades. In the process, however, one psychological detail has been overlooked: the constant desire to have still more things and a still better life, and the struggle to this end imprint many Western faces with worry and even depression, though it is customary to carefully conceal such feelings. This active and tense competition comes to dominate all human thought and does not in the least open a way to free spiritual development. The individual's independence from many types of state pressure has been guaranteed. The majority of people have been granted well-being to an extent their fathers and grandfathers could not even dream about. It has become possible to raise young people according to these ideals, preparing them for and summoning them toward physical bloom, happiness and leisure, the possession of material goods, money and leisure, toward an almost unlimited freedom in the choice of pleasures. So who should now renounce all this? Why and for the sake of what should one risk one's precious life in defense of the common good, and particularly in the nebulous case when the security of one's nation must be defended in an as yet distant land? Even biology tells us that a high degree of habitual well-being is not advantageous to a living organism. Today, well-being in the life of Western society has begun to take off its pernicious mask. Western society has chosen for itself the organization best suited to its purposes, and one I might call legalistic. The terms of human rights and rightness are determined by a system of laws. Such limits are very broad. People in the West have acquired considerable skill in using, interpreting, and manipulating law, though laws tend to be too complicated for an average person to understand without the help of an expert. Every conflict is solved according to the letter of the law, and this is considered to be the ultimate solution. If one is risen from a legal point of view, nothing more is required. Nobody may mention that one could still not be right, and urge self-restraint or a renunciation of these rights, call for sacrifice and selfless risk. This would simply sound absurd. Voluntary self-restraint is almost unheard of. Everybody strives toward further expansion to the extreme limit of the legal frames. An oil company is legally blameless when it buys up an invention of a new type of energy in order to prevent its use. A food product manufacturer is legally blameless when he poisons his produce to make it last longer. After all, people are free not to purchase it. I have spent all my life under a communist regime, and I will tell you that a society without any objective legal scale is a terrible one indeed. But a society based on the letter of the law and never reaching anything higher fails to take full advantage of the full range of human possibilities. The letter of the law is too cold and formal to have a beneficial influence on society. Whenever the tissue of life is woven of legalistic relationships, this creates an atmosphere of spiritual mediocrity that paralyzes man's noblest impulses, and it will be simply impossible to bear up to the trials of this threatening century with nothing but the supports of a legalistic structure. Today's Western society has revealed the inequality between the freedom for good deeds and the freedom for evil deeds. A statesman who wants to achieve something highly constructive for his country has to move cautiously and even timidly. Thousands of hasty and irresponsible critics cling to him at all times. He is constantly rebuffed by Parliament and the press. He has to prove that his every step is well-founded and absolutely flawless. Indeed, an outstanding, truly great person who has unusual and unexpected initiatives in mind does not get any chance to assert himself. Dozens of traps will be set for him from the beginning. Thus, mediocrity triumphs under the guise of democratic restraints. It is feasible and easy everywhere to undermine administrative power, and it has in fact been drastically weakened in all Western countries. The defense of individual rights has reached such extremes as to make society as a whole defenseless against certain individuals. It is time, in the West, to defend not so much human rights as human obligations. On the other hand, destructive and irresponsible freedom has been granted boundless space. Society has turned out to have scarce defense against the abyss of human decadence. For example, against the misuse of liberty for moral violence against young people, such as motion pictures full of pornography, crime, and horror. This is all considered to be part of freedom and to be counterbalanced, in theory, by the young people's right not to look and not to accept. Life organized legalistically has thus shown its inability to defend itself against the corrosion of evil. And what shall we say about the dark realms of overt criminality? Legal limits, especially in the United States, are broad enough to encourage not only individual freedom, but also some misuse of such freedom. The culprit can go unpunished or obtain undeserved leniency, all with the support of thousands of defenders in the society. When a government earnestly undertakes to root out terrorism, public opinion immediately accuses it of violating the terrorists' civil rights. There is quite a number of such cases. This tilt of freedom toward evil has come about gradually, but it evidently stems from a humanistic and benevolent concept according to which man, the master of the world, does not bear any evil within himself, and all the defects of life are caused by misguided social systems, which must therefore be corrected. Yet strangely enough, though the best social conditions have been achieved in the West, there still remains a great deal of crime. There even is considerably more of it than in the destitute and lawless Soviet society. There is a multitude of prisoners in our camps who are termed criminals, but most of them never committed any crime. They merely tried to defend themselves against the lawless state by resorting to means outside the legal framework. The press, too, of course, enjoys the wildest freedom. I shall be using the word press to include all the media, but what use does it make of it? Here again, the overriding concern is not to infringe the letter of the law. There is no true moral responsibility for distortion or disproportion. What sort of responsibility does a journalist or newspaper have to the readership or to history? If they have misled public opinion by inaccurate information or wrong conclusions, even if they have contributed to mistakes on a state level, do we know of any case of open regret voiced by the same journalist or the same newspaper? No. This would damage sales. A nation may be the worse for such a mistake, but the journalist always gets away with it. It is most likely that he will start writing the exact opposite to his previous statements with renewed aplomb. Because instant and credible information is required, it becomes necessary to resort to guesswork, rumors, and suppositions to fill in the voids, and none of them will ever be refuted. They settle into the reader's memory. How many hasty, immature, superficial, and misleading judgments are expressed every day, confusing readers and then left hanging. The press can act the role of public opinion, or miseducate it. Thus we may see terrorists heroized, or secret matters pertaining to the nation's defense publicly revealed, or we may witness shameless intrusion into the privacy of well-known people according to the slogan, quote, "Everyone is entitled to know everything," close quote. But this is a false slogan of a false era. Far greater in value is the forfeited right of people not to know, not to have their divine souls stuffed with gossip, nonsense, vain talk. A person who works and leads a meaningful life has no need for this excessive and burdening flow of information. Hastiness and superficiality, these are the psychic diseases of the 20th century, and more than anywhere else this is manifested in the press. In-depth analysis of a problem is anathema to the press. It is contrary to its nature. The press merely picks out sensational formulas. Such as it is, however, the press has become the greatest power within Western countries, exceeding that of the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Yet one would like to ask, according to what law has it been elected, and to whom is it responsible? In the Communist East, a journalist is frankly appointed as a state official. But who has voted Western journalists into their positions of power, for how long a time, and with what prerogatives? There is yet another surprise for someone coming from the totalitarian East with its rigorously unified press. One discovers a common trend of preferences within the Western press as a whole. Generally accepted patterns of judgment and maybe common corporate interests, the sum effect being not competition but unification. Unrestrained freedom exists for the press but not for the readership, because newspapers mostly transmit in a forceful and emphatic way those opinions which do not too openly contradict their own and that general trend. Without any censorship in the West, fashionable trends of thought and ideas are fastidiously separated from those that are not fashionable, and the latter, without ever being forbidden, have little chance of finding their way into periodicals or books or being heard in colleges. Your scholars are free in the legal sense, but they are hemmed in by the idols of the prevailing fad. There is no open violence, as in the East. However, a selection dictated by fashion, and the need to accommodate mass standards frequently prevents the most independent-minded persons from contributing to public life, and gives rise to dangerous herd instincts that block dangerous herd development. In America, I've received letters from highly intelligent persons, maybe a teacher in a faraway small college, who could do much for the renewal and salvation of his country, but the country cannot hear him because the media will not provide him with a forum. This gives birth to strong mass prejudices, to a blindness which is perilous in our dynamic era. An example is the self-deluding interpretation of the state of affairs in the contemporary world that functions as a sort of petrified armor around people's minds to such a degree that human voices from 17 countries of Eastern Europe and Eastern Asia cannot pierce it. It will be broken only by the inexorable crowbar of events. I have mentioned a few traits of Western life which surprise and shock a new arrival to this world. The purpose and scope of this speech will not allow me to continue such a survey, in particular to look into the impact of these characteristics on important aspects of a nation's life, such as elementary education, advanced education, in the humanities, and art. It is almost universally recognized that the West shows all the world the way to successful economic development, even though in past years it has been sharply offset by chaotic inflation. However, many people living in the West are dissatisfied with their own society. They despise it or accuse it of no longer being up to the level of maturity by mankind, and this causes many to sway toward socialism, which is a false and dangerous current. I hope that no one present will suspect me of expressing my partial criticism of the Western system in order to suggest socialism as an alternative. No, With the experience of a country where socialism has been realized, I shall not speak for such an alternative. The mathematician Igor Shafarevich, a member of the Soviet Academy of Science, has written a brilliantly argued book titled Socialism. This is a penetrating historical analysis demonstrating that socialism of any type and shade leads to a total destruction of the human spirit and to a leveling of mankind into death. Shafarevich's book was published in France almost 2 years ago, and so far no one has been found to refute it. It will shortly be published in English in the US. But should I be asked instead whether I would propose the West, such as it is today, as a model to my country, I would frankly have to answer negatively. No, I could not recommend your society as an ideal for the transformation of ours. Through deep suffering, people in our own country have now achieved a spiritual development of such intensity that the Western system, in its present state of spiritual exhaustion, does not look attractive. Even those characteristics of your life which I have just enumerated are extremely saddening. A fact which cannot be disputed is the weakening of human personality in the West, while in the East it has become firmer and stronger. 6 decades for our people and 3 decades for the people of Eastern Europe. During that time, we have been through a spiritual training far in advance of Western experience. The complex and deadly crush of life has produced stronger, deeper, and more interesting personalities than those generated by standardized Western well-being. Therefore, if our society were to be transformed into yours, it would mean an improvement in certain aspects, but also a change for the worse on some particularly significant points. Of course, a society cannot remain in an abyss of lawlessness, as is the case in our country, but it is also demeaning for it to stay on such a soulless and smooth plane of legalism, as is the case in yours. After the suffering of decades of violence and oppression, the human soul longs for things higher, warmer, and purer than those offered by today's mass living habits, introduced as by a calling card by the revolting invasion of commercial advertising, by TV stupor, and by intolerable music. All this is visible to numerous observers from all the worlds of our planet. The Western way of life is less and less likely to become the leading model. There are telltale symptoms by which history gives warning to the threatened or perishing society. Such are, for instance, a decline of the arts and a lack of great statesmen. Indeed, sometimes the warnings are quite explicit and concrete. The center of your democracy and of your culture is left without electric power for a few hours only, and all of a sudden crowds of American citizens start looting and creating havoc. The smooth surface film must be very thin, the social system quite unstable and unhealthy. But the fight for our planet, physical and spiritual, a fight of cosmic proportions, is not a vague matter of the future. It has already started. The forces of evil have begun their decisive offensive. You can feel their pressure, yet your screens in your publications are full of prescribed smiles and raised glasses. What is the joy about? How has this unfavorable relation of forces come about? How did the West decline from its triumphal march to its present debility? Have there been fatal turns and losses of direction in its development? It does not seem so. The West kept advancing steadily in accordance with its proclaimed social intentions, hand in hand with the dazzling progress in technology, and all of a sudden it found itself in its present state of weakness. This means that the mistake must be at the root, at the very foundation of thought in modern times. I refer to the prevailing Western view of the world in modern times. I refer to the prevailing Western view of the world which was born in the Renaissance and has found political expression since the Age of Enlightenment. It became the basis for political and social doctrine and could be called rationalistic humanism or humanistic autonomy. The proclaimed and practiced autonomy of man from any higher force above him. It could also be called anthropocentricity, with man seen as the center of all. The turn introduced by the Renaissance was probably inevitable historically, The Middle Ages had come to a natural end by exhaustion, having become an intolerable despotic repression of man's physical nature in favor of the spiritual one. But then we recoiled from the spirit and embraced all that is material, excessively and incommensurately. The humanistic way of thinking, which had proclaimed itself our guide, did not admit the existence of intrinsic evil in man, nor did it see any task higher than the attainment of happiness on earth. It started modern Western civilization on the dangerous trend of worshipping man and his material needs. Everything beyond physical well-being and the accumulation of material goods, all other human requirements and characteristics of a subtle and higher nature, were left outside the area of attention of state and social systems, as if human life did not have any higher meaning. Thus gaps were left open for evil, and its drafts blow freely today. Mere freedom per se does not in the least solve all the problems of human life, and even adds a number of new ones. And yet in early democracies, as in American democracy at the time of its birth, all individual human rights were granted on the ground that man is God's creature. That is, freedom was given to the individual conditionally in the assumption of his constant religious responsibility. Such was the heritage of the preceding 1,000 years. 200 or even 50 years ago, it would have seemed quite impossible in America that an individual be granted boundless freedom with no purpose, simply for the satisfaction of his whims. Subsequently, however, all such limitations were eroded everywhere in the West. A total emancipation occurred from the moral heritage of Christian centuries with their great reserves of mercy and sacrifice. State systems were becoming even more materialistic. The West has finally achieved the rights of man, and even excess. But man's sense of responsibility to God and society has grown dimmer and dimmer. In the past decades, the legalistic selfishness of the Western approach to the world has reached its peak, and the world has found itself in a harsh spiritual crisis and a political impasse. All the celebrated technological achievements of progress, including the conquest of outer space, do not redeem the 20th century's moral poverty, which no one could have imagined even as late as the 19th century. As humanism in its development was becoming more and more materialistic, it also increasingly allowed concepts to be used first by socialism and then by communism, so that Karl Marx was able to say in 1844 that, quote, "Communism is naturalized humanism," close quote. This statement is proved to be not entirely unreasonable. One does not see the same stones in the foundations of an eroded humanism and of any type of socialism. Boundless materialism, freedom from religion and religious responsibility, which under communist regimes attains the stage of anti-religious dictatorship. Concentration on social structures with an allegedly scientific approach. This last is typical of both the Age of Enlightenment and of Marxism. It is no accident that all of communism's rhetorical vows revolve around man, with a capital M, and his earthly happiness. At first glance, it seems an ugly parallel. Common traits in the thinking and way of life of today's West and today's East, but such is the logic of materialistic development. The interrelationship is such, moreover, that the current of materialism, which is farthest to the left, and is hence the most consistent, always proves to be stronger, more attractive, and victorious. Humanism, which has lost its Christian heritage, cannot prevail in this competition. Thus, during the past centuries, and especially in recent decades, as the process became more acute, the alignment of forces was as follows. Liberalism was inevitably pushed aside by radicalism. Radicalism had to surrender to socialism, and socialism could not stand up to communism. The communist regime in the East could endure and grow due to the enthusiastic support from an enormous number of Western intellectuals who, feeling the kinship, refused to see communism's crimes. And when they no longer could do so, they tried to justify these crimes. The problem persists. In our Eastern countries, communism has suffered a complete ideological defeat. It is zero and less than zero. And yet, Western intellectuals still look at it with considerable interest and empathy, And this is precisely what makes it so immensely difficult for the West to withstand the East. I am not examining the case of a disaster brought on you by a world war and the changes which it would produce in society. But as long as we wake up every morning under a peaceful sun, we must lead an everyday life. Yet there is a disaster which is already very much with us. I am referring to the calamity of an autonomous, irreligious, humanistic consciousness. It has made man the measure of all things on earth. Imperfect man, who is never free of pride, self-interest, envy, vanity, and dozens of other defects. We are now paying for the mistakes which were not properly appraised at the beginning of the journey. On the way from the Renaissance to our days, we have enriched our experience, but we have lost the concept of a supreme, complete entity which used to restrain our passions and our irresponsibility. We have placed too much hope in politics and social reforms, only to find out that we were being deprived of our most precious possession, our spiritual life. It is trampled by the party mob in the East, by the commercial one in the West. This is the essence of the crisis. The split in the world is less terrifying than the similarity of the disease afflicting its main sections. If, as claimed by humanism, man were born only to be happy, he would not be born to die. Since his body is doomed to death, his task on earth evidently must be more spiritual, not a total engrossment in everyday life, not the search for the best ways to obtain material goods, and then their carefree consumption. It has to be the fulfillment of a permanent, earnest duty, so that one's life journey may become above all an experience of moral growth, to leave life a better human being than one started it. It is imperative to reappraise the scale of the usual human values. Its present incorrectness is astounding. It is not possible that assessment of the president's performance should be reduced to the question of how much money one makes or to the availability of gasoline. Only by the voluntary nurturing in ourselves of freely accepted and serene self-restraint can mankind rise above the world's stream of materialism. Today it would be retrogressive to hold on to the ossified formulas of the Enlightenment. Such social dogmatism leaves us helpless before the trials of our times. Even if we are spared destruction by war, life will have to change in order not to perish on its own. We cannot avoid reassessing the fundamental definitions of human life and society. Is it true that man is above everything? Is there no superior spirit above him? Is it right that man's life and society's activities should be ruled by material expansion above all? Is it permissible to promote such expansion to the detriment of our integral spiritual life? If the world has not approached its end, it has reached a major watershed in history, equal in importance to the turn from Middle Ages to the Renaissance. It will demand from us a spiritual blaze. We shall have to rise to a new height of vision, to a new level of life, where our physical nature will not be cursed, as in the Middle Ages. But even more importantly, our spiritual being will not be trampled upon, as in the modern era. The ascension is similar to climbing onto the next anthropological stage. No one on earth has any other way left but upward. I will end this segment with a song titled In Hell by the French nationalist female musical trio, the Brigands. This song is a perfect bookend to Solzhenitsyn's important message. Here is In Hell by Les Brigands.
Une armée entière d'intellectuels et de faussaires, les bavards universitaires, les spécialistes et les experts, les flics de la pensée cachère, en enfer la meute rouge totalitaire, en enfer charrette entière de dignitaires sanguinaires. L'engeance révolutionnaire dont on veut pas dans les cimetières. Les jacobins génocidaires en enfer, les Dantons et les Robespierre, en enfer, les frères bétonneurs de l'équerre, en enfer. Qu'est-ce qu'on va en faire? Qu'est-ce qu'on va en faire? Mais qu'est-ce qu'on va en faire? Sur la lune, on les mettra sur la lune. La cohorte des grands pervers, idolâtres de la matière, les prix Nobel des pissotières, mandarins des mortelles chimères, les charlatans du cancer, en enfer les sorciers du nucléaire, en enfer les savants transhumanitaires, en enfer. J'ai un convoi protocolaire que des suppôts de Lucifer, les empoisonneurs planétaires dont on veut même pas en enfer, les maîtres des secrets bancaires, en enfer les super vampires milliardaires, en enfer toute l'élite parasitaire, en enfer. Qu'est-ce qu'on va en faire? Qu'est-ce qu'on va en faire? Mais qu'est-ce qu'on va en faire? Sur la lune, on les mettra sur la lune, sur la lune.
In this next segment, I'm honored to introduce a new poet in our spheres who goes by the name Westgarth. To use his own words, quote, "This poem has three main inspirations. Part of the rhetorical style was taken from Shakespeare's speeches and monologues, especially his version of Mark Antony's funeral oration. I find Shakespeare fascinating for the playful creativity he shows in exploring wide-ranging ideas and human types. The second source is the indomitable Nietzsche, who also inspired my style, but most of all the ideas and themes of the poem, which is a view of recent events from a position beyond good and evil, and the crucial need to avoid falling into resentment or else lead one's way out and beyond that mental trap. My third inspiration has been my personal experience of the last year and a half. I, like many in these circles, was around 15 and 16 when the Brexit Trump phenomenon broke out before us, and the years have since given me the sight to witness and put into words the madness of ever-escalating events from my home in northern England. As I found writing this poem to be a kind of outlet during it all, I hope it can be for others too." Close quote. Here is The Good by Wes Garth, read by Nullis. The Good. Do what is right, so say the good. All good souls in one brave brotherhood. Their hands are tied, they do only what is right. In those who would not, they perceive only a blight. Everyone is doing it, they announce as one's justified, the herald call of those with authority by their side. Come now, it wouldn't be meet to make a scene, to say, to do, to think, what the good deem obscene. We are in this together, they also have said. With such thoughts and with clammy hands, they pull you into their freshly made bed. It is on behalf and for the greatest number. On these grounds, how can you refuse to join them in slumber? It must be done, so they have perceived. They hold as if their own this opinion they have received. When did the crowds cry the experts are wrong? Once or twice, but never for long. But who could have known, they will eventually say, as the pictures clears late in the day. They merely followed as they were told. Who would accuse such good people? Who is that bold? We did what was right at the time. With much clutching of pearls they will chime. And never any credit will you receive. Rather their own memory would the multitude deceive. They live below the clouds, alas, so says my mind. Our difference is not of grade, but kind. And if you of finer stuff are made, mistake not the shovel for the spade. In the end they were under command. Who am I for an apology demand? In better times would their fidelity not be good, had their leaders been of finer blood. And what now must I do with this thought, that with the blood of tyrants freedom is bought? Yes, you above the clouds, that is the price of your liberty. But only for you few, not that good multiplicity. I will now read 2 poems from tonight's guest, Spencer Quinn. You can find Spencer's poems on American Renaissance. Here is The School of Truth by Spencer Quinn, read by Nullis, followed with Forbear by Spencer Quinn, read by Nullis. The School of Truth. Look out, my precious child, upon your way to School of Truth. What keener way, they said and smiled, to wean away your precious youth. The truth they teach has many heads, they're scaled with justice, each unblind, which bind you just like newlyweds to ancient chains of men unspined. They say, white children pose a threat. You have not yielded perfect form. You have not learned your history yet. Your ageless victims linger warm. A perfect form, a perfect peach, a holy vessel never rots, and now we have you in our reach, where we can love you into knots. Our racial theory cleaves your mind, for justice deems it just and wise, that you white children know your kind, for only you we shall chastise. Because you're white, you know your guilt, from which we sinless are absolved, and celebrating as you wilt, make way, it's been resolved. We are the School of Truth. We are the School of Truth. Deniers ruined as uncouth shall not withstand the School of Truth. Look out, my precious child, upon your way to School of Truth, where innocence will be defiled, and savage faces smash your youth. Forbear, where is your sword and cross emblazoned shield? The motley, godless, neutered horde compels your heirs to yield. Our race today, unrecognized, abandons our renown, our lands and holdings colonized by tan and black and brown. Contrition sways, we've shed our will, embarrassed by our might, as interlopers have their thrill of conquering despite. Alone are we subjected to this truthless blight of mind, which desecrates the rendezvous of European kind. We bent the knee to God forbear, and country, king and queen. Today we bend our gender pair into a thing obscene. Our worthy line we now forsake, our doubled genes recoil. Misshapen minds their image make, in children they embroil. Our sons cringe into daughters now, their weakness all agleam. The scalpel, shot, and drugs somehow embolden their esteem. The cradle that our daughters spurn lies filled with hopes unfound, or tawny whelps when strangers yearn to run our race aground. Forbear, forbear, should this go further, my innocence, I fear, negotiates transcendent murder, and two may disappear. Awash am I in desperate brood, please speak to me, forbear. How can our lives but soon conclude, should I forbear, forbear? I would like to end this segment with an epic piano piece composed by Andrei Moiseyev titled Alchemy of Ruin. In the next segment, I'm honored to have Spencer Quinn as my special guest for this week's conversation. Hello, sir. It's great to have you on the show. Could you tell us a bit about yourself for those who may not be familiar with your work and background? Also, please let the audience know where they may be able to find you.
I am a writer, an author, an essayist. I most often write for Countercurrents. So you can find my work at Countercurrents. That's counter-currents.com. I have a number of essays there. I also have a novel published with them called White Like You. While I've been trying to, produce an essay a week for Countercurrents, I've also had some poetry published at American Renaissance. I've had an article published at the Occidental Observer. I've published a novel with Logic, otherwise known as the Free Speech Library, called Charity's Blade. I had a children's book, like a little board book produced by the White People Press called My Mirror Tells a Story. And most recently, I have published with Antelope Hill a book called Solzhenitsyn and the Right, which is a collection of my essays on Solzhenitsyn's work.
We've had you on Conversations with the Wind before. I've also read one of your poems, Forbear, on my YouTube channel. You do excellent work. We've had you on Imperium Art with Donald. So you are one of our regulars, and you are always a welcome guest. I want to open this segment with the general theme of anti-communist literature, and I'm going to kick off the conversation with the following question. There are many reasons why writers may choose to criticize communism. Not all writers are motivated by the same impetus. Do you consider yourself an anti-communist writer? And if so, then why?
Okay, well, I think this goes beyond just being a writer. I'm an anti-communist person in the same way that I'm a pro-civilization person. I recognize that communism, and then as opposed to, so light forms of socialism, but just hard communism, brings about the most oppression, the most misery, the most death, the most awful stuff that, you can't really be in favor of that unless you want to tear down civilization in some way or another. So, I consider myself that as a person. And as a result of that, my writings will reflect that.
It's also interesting. I recently spoke about this, where I believe that the foundation starts with identity, understanding yourself, understanding your surroundings, understanding where you come from so that you know where you're going. Identity must always trump ideology. But what's more important is that some ideologies are more in line with your identity, your organic identity, and others create artificial identities that take you away from that understanding of self. And I believe that some of these ideologies that take you away from yourself are destructive and in some cases, many cases, evil. And communism, in my view, is one of those ideologies that tears you away from who you are as an individual and also the community to which you belong. What do you think about that?
I agree with that. When you read about how communism affected people's minds, where they renounced family, they renounced nation, they renounced religion, and people behaved in ways that were just so obviously ridiculous that you begin to realize, okay, their minds have been warped by this communist. I don't know if it's an ideology or what. It's more like a mind virus, where you basically are fed lies and told that they're truths. And when you do that, when that happens, there's really nothing good that can come out of it. It also encourages more lies and encourages cowardice. It encourages just basically all the worst aspects of humanity. And you can have certain ideologies that are not harmful or good for you in particular, and that's great. I mean, if it's a productive thing that matches your personality, matches your identity, and it doesn't harm anyone, then fine. That there's nothing wrong with that. There's some ideologies that are neutral or not harmful, but communism, I think, goes beyond a mere ideology. It's basically a system of oppression, and a system of terror, at least in its purest form. I mean, you can argue that the the Chinese are still communists, but it's kind of hard to argue that today. It's kind of hard to argue even the late Soviet period compared to the early Soviet period. So there's a range there, but basically what it boils down to is, are you being fed lies or not?
Exactly.
And if that's basically what it boils down to, I would say.
Yeah, and of course, we have to dispel the argument that, quote, communism is only a system of economics, bro. It's not an ideology. I vehemently dispute that position, because communism is an ideology wrapped in an economic theory, maybe, but it's still an ideology, and we have to address it as such. So whether you have 1,000,001 iterations of communist Marxist thought, various forms of its evolution throughout the last century and a half, if you go back to the roots of it, it's always the same. It's not purely just an economic theory, and I strongly dispel that argument. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, you're correct. The thing is that from what I remember reading was the Communist Manifesto or Das Kapital, I forget which one, but I read some Marx in college, and the basic idea is a certain kind of egalitarianism between the proletariat and the aristocracy. Mm-hmm. And you can build a whole body of work, of economic work, based on that presupposition. But the communists in real life in the 20th century took it much farther than that. It wasn't merely about economics. It was about, in every possible way, that people are equal. So if you were part of the ruling class, well, you would get torn down. And if you were not part of the ruling class, or if you were an ethnic outsider in Russia, well, then you would be promoted, because they want to sort of, I guess, make up for what they perceived as past oppression or whatever, or past inequality with present inequality. But the theory behind it was that everyone is equal, and that's a lie. That is a bold-faced lie. So therefore, yes, it goes well beyond economics. Although, yes, you can talk about the economic aspects of communism, especially from a theoretical standpoint. But once you start talking about history and things that happen in real life, it goes way beyond economics.
Obviously, one can make a Marxist economic argument. That's not to say that Marxism doesn't have nuggets of truth embedded into the ideology. And when I say nuggets of truth, what I'm really talking about is the appropriation and subversion of ideas that have preceded Marxism. I'm thinking of the Prussian socialist ideas. I'm also thinking of medieval organic collectivism that's inherent to the way the European man thinks. Marxism takes these ideas and appropriates it and then repackages it into something completely different, then turns it into something that it's not. And that's what we see today with many different things, even in what people would call the left Catholic mentality. This liberation theology is a full appropriation of understanding of what Catholicism should stand for, as opposed to what they're misrepresenting it as. So we have to understand that there's a strong subversive element here, and this subversive element is found in the root of communism, in my humble opinion. I just want to jump to the next question. Left-wing literature is more widely accepted, while right-wing literature is often demonized. Does anti-left literature necessarily have to be explicitly political in order to counter left-wing literature?
Well, I mean, there's many different kinds of literature. You have fiction, you have poetry, you have essays, you have longer nonfiction. I mean, I guess it depends on the type of literature. But if the thing is explicitly anti-left, then by definition, it is going to be political. So you can write a book about how Joe Biden is destroying America or whatever, and that's That's anti-left, sure, and it's political. You could write a story that is has a Joe Biden-like character in it, and it could make everybody laugh at that person or that character and mock that character and such, and that would be anti-left, although not explicitly so. There's a whole range there, I would say. But yeah, if you're going to have something that's explicitly anti-left, then by definition, it's political.
You have exactly what you said. These writings that are explicitly anti-left as a balance against the leftist tropes that are presented in leftist literature. But at the same time, you also have stories, poems, novels, various forms of literature that represent traditional values, that might represent historic continuity, various Christian or other religious symbols, but in particular the Christian tradition for Europeans is a inherently anti-leftist position. Now, that's not because those positions are necessarily anti-left. It's because the left defines themselves against these values. So by them defining themselves against these values, these works of art become inherently, explicitly anti-left.
Well, I don't know about explicit, but inherent, yes. So, like, for example, last summer, I reviewed a book for Countercurrents called Growth of the Soil by Knut Hamsun. And, it was a wonderful story, and I recommend it. It's really a great novel. But inherent in that novel is an appreciation for the people. Was it Norway, Sweden? Oh, golly, I'm forgetting his nation of origin. But I mean, an inherent appreciation for the Scandinavian people and the family. And of the family and of the town, the nation, or whatever. And it doesn't show them as perfect. It shows them as corruptible. It shows them as, in many cases, very problematic. There's dishonesty going on. There's crimes committed. There's one of the most sympathetic characters commits a pretty heinous crime, at some point. I mean, so there's a lot there to chew on. And there's until the end, you get no mention of any kind of politics at all. Maybe it's just, and that mention that you get at the very end is very, very brief. Okay. And yet this is still a very profound, I hate to say anti-leftist, because it's not, it's more just pro-European or pro-Scandinavian or pro-family, that kind of thing, which is extremely wholesome, despite the fact that there's a lot of all the faults and peccadillos that people have are presented right there on the page, so it's not like we're looking at it through rose-tinted glasses here. So there's a difference between that kind of positivity and something that's explicitly anti-left, which is also fine too, although maybe less so in fiction and more so, in a book of essays or something along those lines, where you tell the reader right up front, I'm anti-left. Here are my reasons why. Bang, 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 bang. And that's one thing. But when it comes to art, in my opinion, you're going to probably want to have a more of a pro rather than an anti-attitude when you're doing your writing, because if you have an anti-attitude, even if that anti-attitude is righteous, it kind of defines the work by what it's not, by with a negative instead of a positive, and it also makes it seem like you have an axe to grind. And that axes to grind are great, but usually you want to have it in nonfiction, in essays and stuff, where you say to the reader up front, "Look, I have an axe to grind. I'm going to grind it now," yep. And then the reader will know what they're getting. Whereas in fiction, in more artistic forms, you really don't want to do that unless you're trying to be funny.
So the reason I consider this a difficult question is because on the one hand, you might have a work of fiction that is very explicitly representative of certain traditional values, whether that's family values, whether that's an understanding of nationalism, whether that's an understanding of the greater community, or if it's a religious work, if it has something. So what I see, I'm sorry, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to add religion in that list you were making.
And especially with religion, I think that Marxism, the left, always seeks to replace religion with its own form of religion. The left will define certain works as explicitly anti-left, even though the work itself was not created as an explicitly anti-left work. But then you also have works that the left will appropriate and then subvert, where you see something like Lord of the Rings, for example, constantly being appropriated, inverted, twisted around, even though Tolkien himself said that this was and had very strong explicit Catholic elements to it. The left will take that, and of course also Nordic mythology is embedded into it. So I don't want to say it's just purely a Catholic work, because it does have strong elements of the Nordic mythology. It also has strong elements of Catholic faith in it. Suffice it to say, the left will then take this work and appropriate it and then redefine it to fit its own narrative. So I think that you have these two layers of the way the left handles, let's just call it right-wing literature. Either they will demonize it or they will try to appropriate and subvert it. Let's jump to the next question. There's a wealth of anti-communist literary material from Russia and Central and Eastern Europe. Can you give some American or Western European examples of explicitly anti-communist writers or writers who focused on anti-communism?
Sure. Okay. So Alexander Solzhenitsyn is the subject of my latest book. So you really can't get too much more anti-communist than him. He spent 8 years in a gulag, and he wrote the Gulag Archipelago and some other works that not just criticized communism, but just basically portrayed it as evil, unworkable, oppressive. It's not about criticizing it in order to make it better so much as just to say, this is a completely worthless, less than worthless ideology or form of government, or however you want to describe it. So so if you want to read about anti-communism, you could do a lot worse than the Gulag Archipelago. It's very long, but you can go there. Then there's another famous person from the Soviet Union was Varlam Shalamov, and he wrote Kolmia stories. There's a recent translation of that. That's also very long, but you could check that out as well. He spent some time in the camps, a lot of time in the camps as well, and had his life ruined as a result. Solzhenitsyn was able to recover, and he had a family with children after he was exiled to the West, whereas actually he had the children in the Soviet, or I'm pretty sure he had all three of his kids before he was exiled, but they were very young. Whereas Shalamov, I don't think he survived that well. I think after he was let out of the camps, he was distanced from his family and basically kind of died lonely. And I'm pretty sure that's how it worked out for him, which is very unfortunate. Another writer is Krasnov, P.N. Krasnov. He wrote a novel called From Double Eagle to Red Flag. And he was basically a general in the White Army. And so, you're going to get, he actually fought the Reds. So you're going to get a lot of that there. One book that made a big impression on me in college was Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler. He's a Jewish author, but this short novel is, you can't put it down. It really demonstrates all the bad things about communism and just how oppressive it is and how it just inspires people to be at their worst. So that made a huge impression on me when I read it at age like 19 or 20, whatever it was. There's a book called Behind Communism by Frank Britton. You can read that. Robert Conquest wrote, I'm sure he wrote more than what I've just read, but I've read The Great Terror by him, which I recommend. I can't recommend it enough. The Great Terror demonstrates how communism, I guess in my opinion, brings civilization to its absolute lowest point. I mean, you can't get worse than this, where you have evil people doing evil things to both innocent and other evil people, corrupting innocent people to become become evil. I mean, it's just a big mess. And The Great Terror, I couldn't put it down. I mean, it was a very powerful work. Another one is called Harvest of Sorrow, which is about the Holodomor, the terror famines in Ukraine and I believe Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan. And if you look in the bibliography of that book, you can probably see some other stuff, some other books you can find that are basically about communism and how bad it is. So that you could do that. There's also a famous book by, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but I think it's Pidhany, called The Black Deeds of the Kremlin. And you could download that online. It costs lots of money if you want to actually buy it because it's way out of print. But The Black Deeds of the Kremlin is another one. There's The Black Book of Communism. It has various authors. You can check that out. Another writer I like who's not very well known is Gareth Jones. Recently, the Polish director Agnieszka Holland directed a movie about him called Mr. Jones. And he was a journalist that went more or less undercover into the Soviet Union and observed the Holodomor by firsthand when the New York Times and other pro news organs of the West were denying that the starvation was happening, or they were downplaying it. You know about that's a very famous thing. And Gareth Jones was a person who exposed the crimes of the Soviets at a time when it was being hushed up by the liberal elites of the West. And Walter Duranty is the great example of that. And Walter Duranty in the movie is portrayed as a degenerate who, has these orgies and stuff. And I didn't know that, if that's true or not. But in any event, he was portrayed very badly, whereas Gareth Jones was portrayed very positively because he was a very positive guy. And I don't think he has any books, but you can go online and there's at least one website dedicated to his writings. I think he was later on assassinated by the Soviets, which is very unfortunate because he was a brave soul. I think that's a good place to start, I would say. I'm sure there's a lot more than that.
In my introduction, I mentioned various motivations. So you might have the Reformed Socialist, the Nationalist, the Christian Traditionalists, and even the Liberals, who would have different positions on their stance against communism, against various iterations of communism, such as Bolshevism. So you will have, in the Hungarian tradition, you have many writers, nationalists like Nyír József or Vas Albert. Then you have someone like János Pilinszky, who is a Catholic poet. Just by being a Catholic poet, he became an anti-communist. You had many different forms of motivation that could lead someone to become an anti-communist. Cecil Tormai was a writer who wrote many excellent books. I strongly recommend her book, The Outlaw's Diary, which gives a very scathing view of the Hungarian Bolshevik Republic that formed shortly after World War I. Of course, many of these writers that I mentioned were later demonized by the left and continue to be demonized by the left for one reason or another, somehow fitting into that 20th century mythology of liberating Europe from the evils of nationalism, which we'll get to a bit later in our conversation. So I think that you always have to look at various forms of motivation. And when you're looking at American writers or Western European writers, if they have an anti-communist stance, then they're going to probably incorporate whatever tradition they come from, whether that's a liberal or a patriotic or even a nationalist position. I'm just going to jump to the next. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Hold on. I wanted to add a couple things. One, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's Imperium Press has maybe a recent translation of The Outlaw's Diary. I have an older version of it, but I think that there's a new edition out, and I think it's Imperium Press that has it.
I believe it's Antelope Hill, I think.
Okay, then it's Antelope Hill. It's all right, and also, I wanted to add that the very public dispute between Solzhenitsyn and Andrei Sakharov also is an example of what you were discussing, because Sakharov was also a political dissident in the Soviet Union, but he was at heart an urbane, enlightenment-loving liberal, and so he would criticize the Soviets for their oppression and et cetera. But at heart, he was a liberal. And that led to some strife with him and Solzhenitsyn, because Solzhenitsyn was pointing out that this liberal attitude that you have is what leads to Bolshevism. And, you may think that you're better than Bolshevism, but, ultimately Bolshevism springs from the kind of liberalness that you express. And they might have reconciled as old men slightly, but if you read From Under the Rubble, you will see that Solzhenitsyn he and Sakharov had major issues with each other, despite the fact that they were both anti-Soviet, anti-communist dissidents.
That's an important point. We have to understand that being anti-communist could mean different things. When they thought they destroyed the monster of communism, then all of these divergent thoughts and ideologies and worldviews conflicted with each other. So they finally then came to the realization that we're, maybe united against one thing, but then we're not the same. This ties back into this question of identity over ideology. It also ties into the question of understanding that there's a lot of arguments, especially now online everywhere. You'll see arguments about whether, communism was bad, communism was good. Then you see these very weird communist apologetic arguments made. So a lot of strange things pop up once the monster has been defeated. All of these different points of view were always at odds with each other. The only thing that brought them together was the fact that they were all oppressed by communism. But I agree with Solzhenitsyn's point that communism is a version of liberalism. I would make that argument myself. So let's go to the next question. You chose a complex subject matter that deals with often contradicting nuance. Please tell us about your book and what motivated you to write about Solzhenitsyn.
I came to Solzhenitsyn, late, and the reason why I came to him was because I was doing research. This was maybe, 9 years ago, 8 years ago. I was doing research for my novel White Like You, and I wanted to have some discussion on the Jewish question, and that I went online and I saw that people were recommending a book by Benjamin Ginsberg, a Jewish author, called The Fatal Embrace. And so said that shed a lot of light on the issue. So I read it. And the author very casually mentions how Jewish communists during the 20s and 30s committed tremendous atrocities or helped commit tremendous atrocities. And, he talks about the Gulag system, the Belomor Canal, and, the Holodomor and other things like that. Well, actually, I don't know if he goes with the Holodomor directly, but he definitely talked about the Gulags and the Belomor Canal. And I went to the source of that book, and it was a book called Stalin's War Against the Jews by Louis Rappaport. So I bought that, and it was accurately represented from that book. But then I looked at the sources that book was using, and it went to Gulag Archipelago. And I had a copy of the Gulag Archipelago in my library, but I hadn't read it. So I grab it. I was all excited because I need to read this now. But to my chagrin, I noticed that it was book 1 of 3. And, and it was 600 and change pages. And so I thought, oh boy, I got a lot of reading to do. And so I got the other 2 volumes of the book. And these are paperbacks from the 70s that are $1.95. I mean, Solzhenitsyn insisted to the publisher that they be as cheap as possible so as many people can purchase them. And that's when I started reading Solzhenitsyn, and I realized, oh my God, this guy's work is vital. And once I read that book, that, and I would say the Culture Critique, or the two books that probably really changed my outlook on things. I was a different person by the time I finished reading the Gulag Archipelago. And then when I started writing for Countercurrents, I had the idea that, let's write a whole bunch of essays about Solzhenitsyn and put it in a book for his 100th anniversary of his birth in 2018. But of course, I didn't make that. But I was 3 years late. But I still, from the beginning, I envisioned writing a collection of essays that would distill his ideas in such a way that would make him very valuable to the right and not require people to do all the legwork that I did. Because Solzhenitsyn's work is very long, and many people get intimidated by that. They don't want to read, thousands and thousands of pages. Now if they want to, that's great. And if they want to read Solzhenitsyn and write my book and go on and read Solzhenitsyn as a result, that's fantastic. But you don't have to. In other words, I'm doing the work that you don't have to do. So you pick up this 200-page slender volume, and you can, in my opinion, get many of Solzhenitsyn's ideas distilled down to in such a way that you could use them in debate. You can change your thinking, or you can reaffirm your identity, that kind of thing. That's how I would like to see this book to be used by people on the right. It's just a way that I've done all the work reading thousands of his pages, and you can take that research and run with it. Another thing is, if you go on any of these official supporters of Solzhenitsyn, their sites like the Solzhenitsyn Center, what these folks are going to try to do is place Solzhenitsyn within the Overton window and portray him not as a dissident or a radical on the in present day West. They're going to portray him as somebody that shouldn't be demonized. And my work is saying, no, he's to the right of the Overton window. So a proper interpretation of Solzhenitsyn is to place him outside of that and say he is a true dissident. He wasn't just a dissident in the Soviet Union. He's a dissident today. And dissidents can get a lot out of him, because at heart he was an ethnocentrist. Yes, he was a Russian ethnocentrist, and that's fine. But whites, the diaspora Europeans in America or Australia or wherever, they can take his ideas and replace Russian with white or diaspora white, and then you will have the same kind of ethnocentrism for my people, in America or in Australia or South Africa or any other place. So Solzhenitsyn can be appropriated in that way as well, making him quite the dissident.
You answered the next question as well, because I wanted to ask, since Solzhenitsyn, as you correctly said, is both lionized and demonized by the Western cultural elite, and his body of work can either evoke an emotional cathartic reaction, or it can provide a strictly ideological response from the reader. So it's important for us to understand how we should interpret Solzhenitsyn's body of work, how we need to understand and contextualize it in our current day. Because I do agree with you that there's a lot of parallels from which we can draw. There are a lot of important messages that we can learn. Do you have any examples maybe that you could give the audience?
One thing I wanted to add was that if you want to talk about interpreting Solzhenitsyn like in a nutshell, after my reading of his work, I would say that he is equal parts pro-ethnocentrism and anti-progressive. That's if you had to describe him in two words, that would be it. And then from there you can say, well, he was very pro-Eastern Orthodox Christian, pro-Christianity, pro-Russian, pro-tradition, anti-communist, anti-decadence. He hated decadence. And anti-enlightenment. If you read my chapter on the Harvard Address, that's what he discusses is how the Enlightenment leads to, or taking the Enlightenment too seriously will lead to decadence, and the misuse of freedom and the neglect of duty, things like that, that he experienced when he was in exile in the West. And that made him very unpopular with many of our elites. in America when he lived here. So, like, and I'll give you an example of how this was. His biggest supporters were not just the National Review crowd, like I can't think of Buckley or those guys. I mean, but it was also Jesse Helms. I don't know if anybody remembers Helms, but Helms was a senator from North Carolina who was extremely race realist. And he was very, very far to the right. I mean, I guess, he was very skeptical of Jews or of Israel up to a point. And then I think what happened was in 1980, he squeaked past Mark Hunt. I forgot Hunt, I think his last name was. I forgot the guy's first name. But he squeaked past a very powerful Democratic contender for his Senate seat in an election. I think he won by 1,000 or a couple thousand votes or something. And then after that, he sort of embraced Israel. So I think that that might have had something to do with it. But he was a very strong right-wing presence, and he loved Solzhenitsyn. He was one of the first people that wrote Solzhenitsyn when Solzhenitsyn landed in Switzerland. He tried to promote a bill in the Senate to make Solzhenitsyn an honorary citizen of the United States. And the only other people who are honorary citizens of the United States were Lafayette and Churchill. So, I mean, that's there are not many people in that group. So that gives you an example of how he was perceived back in the day. And then, of course, later on in the 80s, when the anti-Semitism charge really picked up steam, and then he was demonized by many, many people. And it was a pretty horrific thing he had to go through to defend himself. But that's getting aside from the point.
That's actually a very interesting aspect of Solzhenitsyn, where he was embraced by so many people in the West. When you see these Cold War era dissidents flee to the West, you'll see a clamor of different groups try to project their values onto that individual. You'll see people that Solzhenitsyn himself would have derided, extol all of his virtues. And so there's a lot of contradiction going on with regard to the current mainstream interpretation of Solzhenitsyn and many dissident writers from Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. So you'll see this also probably as a directed attempt to try to make sure that they control the narrative, to make sure that whatever this dissident writer believes is not fully represented in the mainstream understanding or interpretation of said individual, of said dissident.
That's exactly correct. And I think in the case of Solzhenitsyn, this relies on the general ignorance of most people regarding 200 Years Together.
Right.
And some of the more unseemly aspects of the response to the revised version of August 1914. And also, there's, if you really dive in to his works, you'll see that it's impossible to make Solzhenitsyn a mainstream figure. It's impossible because he was, I would say he was race realist, at least regarding the Jews. Mm-hmm. He I don't think he hated the Jews. People would call him an anti-Semite or whatever. I don't even know what that term means, but as a smear, it's effective. But as a way of uncovering the truth, I don't think it's effective at all. And but people would say he's anti-Semitic, and I don't think that's true because he shows a lot of appreciation for Jews, but at the same time, he's quite honest about them and says, these are the problems that we have with them. And this is outlined in 200 Years Together. And if that were to be published in English, it would be impossible to keep him in the mainstream. And so when folks talk about Solzhenitsyn and they want to appropriate him, as you would say, they would rather, my hunch is that perhaps they'd rather not pick a fight with someone of that towering stature. I mean, why do that, especially if most people don't know about his most poignant works. So I think a lot of it has to do with the ignorance regarding the unpublished 200 Years Together. And that's one reason why I dedicated 4 chapters to that work, because that needs to get out there. People need to know about it.
This accusation of hate, this accusation of anti-Semitism, this accusation of being against something is really an artificial, concocted idea. It's not something that is real to the author himself. You'll have a diversion from objectively speaking about what actually happened, and then diverting into a narrative that is supposedly hate-filled. And there's no hate in it. It's just an objective truth. We have to talk about these things, but of course, there are certain taboo topics that we are not allowed to talk about. And that's where this conflict happens.
Well, I mean, it's what Vox Day says. You know, the social justice warriors always project. And so when you have a left-wing partisan who listens to an objective or reads an objective account of the Jewish role in communism in the Soviet period, in the early Soviet period especially, they're not capable of appreciating that as a simple recounting of fact, but they're going to project and interpret that as a partisan screed because they themselves make a living, live by the partisan screed. So they're accusing whoever they would consider to be their political opponents or enemies of being anti-Semitic when in fact they're just telling the truth. You see, and Solzhenitsyn will intersperse flattering things along with the critical things, and he will express a fervent and heartfelt desire for reconciliation between Russians and Jews. And he does this numerous times in 200 Years Together. He also takes time out to criticize his fellow Russians. In fact, he absolves the Jews from the February Revolution. He says basically this was the fault of Russians and Russians only, or for the most part Russians. And but none of that matters. I mean, if he makes efforts to be objective and makes efforts to quote Jewish sources, which is what he does often in 200 Years Together, none of that matters because these stupid left-wing partisans can't imagine themselves not projecting. They must project their evil upon truth tellers. And that's a tragedy, in my opinion.
Sadly, we see the same knee-jerk reaction from conservatives. We see that once you touch upon a certain taboo subject like this, and you try to address it objectively, without hate, without any kind of ideological underpinning, you still get this reaction from the conservative right. Well, let me rephrase that, from the conservative liberals. And I maybe I should make a point of saying that I personally don't consider conservatives to be right-wing. They're just essentially liberals who would like to keep the status quo that was established 2 centuries ago. I don't think that they're right-wing in the ideological sense, and I don't think that they're right-wing in the organic sense of understanding of identity. With that said, I also see the conservative movement projecting itself onto Solzhenitsyn as this icon of anti-communism, but they don't want to acknowledge the root cause of communism. They don't want to acknowledge the culpability of various Jewish elites who were instrumental in creating the monstrosity that became Bolshevism. So there's a
fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. But you're right. But that's preferable than agreeing with the Bolsheviks, which is what many on the left do.
Well,
I mean, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely, and you're right as well. So we do have to make a distinction between understanding the evils of communism, which is an important thing we need to understand. We also have to recognize how we got there. A large percentage of our own people believe this. They're religious acolytes of this leftist religion that's being created. You can't just say that it's just this one group or it's that one other group. It could be your neighbor, it could be your brother-in-law, sister-in-law, it could be your brother or sister, it could be someone in your family, it could be anyone who has been indoctrinated into this destructive, subversive ideology. One can argue well, they were subverted, they were brainwashed, and we have to, help them. But we have to take responsibility, and we have to ask ourselves, how did we allow this to happen? Solzhenitsyn also points at that. And I think that's an important point that we should all take from this.
No, I totally agree.
How can we use examples from literature in general, but Solzhenitsyn in specifically, to reconcile this persistent false mythology about how, for example, the Soviet Red Army liberated Europe from evil nationalists? But we can take this one step further. We can also say, how can we reconcile this false mythology about socialism and communism being the cure-all for all the ills of the world?
Well, I think one of the first steps one has to take to become a dissident today, in my opinion, is to recognize that the Bolsheviks were worse than the Nazis. It took me years to come to that conclusion. It's not an easy one to come to because, we're trained at birth practically to believe that there's nothing worse than a Nazi. You could be a pedophile and you're not as bad as a Nazi, right? I mean, you could be the kind of person that commits all sorts of a mass murderer. You're not as bad as a Nazi. That is a form of just insidious brainwashing. And it's also what I've discovered, a lie. And once you realize that the Bolsheviks were worse than the Nazis, then, a lot of the brainwashing just gets dispelled and you begin to see very clearly. Now, of course, I'm not going to say that the Nazis were free of sin or they didn't commit atrocities in warfare, as many people in war throughout history have done. Like, for example, Julius Caesar versus the Gauls. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can't really get more atrocious than that. And yet, nobody's demonizing Julius Caesar, for killing 2 million Gauls or whatever it was. You have to remember that during warfare, bad things are going to happen. And the Nazis were very good at doing bad things during war. Okay, fine. And if you want to hate them for that, okay, fine. However, the Soviets also did a lot of bad things during war, but what's worse is that they did really bad things during peacetime. Okay, so Solzhenitsyn describes how after they won the day against the whites in the Civil War, their next order of business was basically to liquidate all of their opponents, and they perceived innocent people who were just men and women on the street, for previously supporting the Tsar, or for previously being a Christian, or for previously, being a part of the bourgeoisie or whatever. Oh, you're slated for extinction. They're going to shoot you or put you in a gulag. I mean, they just went after the people they perceived as cultural enemies. The kulaks were a great example. These were Ukrainian or Russian peasants who formerly their ancestors had been serfs. They had been liberated in the 1860s or whenever it was, and they managed to make agriculture work for them. And so these kulaks were people who were successful serfs, and many of them owned land, many of them had guns, many of them were Christian, many of them were very conservative, and they, of course, were opposed to the communist takeover in Moscow and St. Petersburg and places like that. And so after the Civil War ended, they just went after these people. And what made you a kulak differed over time. A kulak was one thing at one point, then they'd wipe out all of them or send them to gulags, and then, now these people are kulaks, let's go after them too. That was the way the left worked, or way the Bolsheviks worked. And as a result of 15 years of these atrocities, you had about 20 million people killed. I mean, maybe more, I don't know. Robert Conquest gives the number of people who were starved to death in the terror famines to be around 15.5 million. We talk about in Robert Conquest also estimates about 2.5 million people were killed during the Great Terror. That was 1933, 1938 basically in there. The how many people were killed in the gulags? How many people were killed on the Belomor Canal? Like hundreds of thousands there. I mean, you add it all up and it's around 20 million, I would say. And this all happened during peacetime. And then, so therefore, and this is during the time when the Nazis, the Nazis, we should give them credit for it. In the 1930s, Germany was doing far better economically than America was when they were hit by the Depression, or definitely better than the Soviets. Everyone was better than the Soviets in terms of, just economics, in terms of how much poverty was in that nation. And it was nationalist right-wing policies that were, national socialists that actually led to tremendous prosperity relative to what was going on with the New Deal. And you can look into the New Deal and see who was behind it. And there are, quite a few names that echo into history who were behind the New Deal. Frankfurter was one of them, but there were several. So you can make an argument there that the nationalists, the fascists, had something on the other peoples of the world. But basically, what it boils down to is when you look at the 30s, the 20s and 30s, you can realize that no nation had more sin and more blood on its hands than the Soviet Union. At least no civilized nation at that time. And once you realize that, then all the other myths that you talk about are pretty easily dismissed, because they will raise you the Jewish Holocaust, and you can say, well, then I'll raise you again and talk about the atrocities of the Soviets, and they have no answer to that.
The argument that you always hear, or the counterpoint that you always hear, is, well, the Soviets didn't have any kind of racial ideologies. It was all class-based ideology, whereas...
That's a lie. That's a complete lie.
Oh, no, absolutely. But that's the argument that you would hear from, for example, somebody who's sympathetic to socialism, communism, and things like that.
But even if they did, so what? I mean, like, in other words, if a regime kills 5 million people for racial reasons, does that make them worse than another regime which kills 20 million people for non-racial reasons?
Right. Well, this ties in.
At the end of the day, that's the thing. I mean, like, if you're a murder victim, does it matter if you're killed because you're white or you're killed for no reason at all? I mean, you're still getting killed, right? I mean, this whole thing about people getting this obsession about race behind everything is a little silly, I think, because you can commit atrocities for many, many reasons, and atrocities are always bad, and so it doesn't really matter if it's racially motivated or not. But then you could make an argument that the Bolsheviks were very philo-Semitic, very pro-Jewish, but very pro-diaspora Jewish. They were anti-Zionist. Mm-hmm. They weren't into that, and they had a complicated relationship with the Jewish Bund as well, I'm pretty sure. But ultimately, though, if you were a committed member of the Jewish diaspora, where you did not have any ambitions to return to an Israel or something like that, then Bolshevism was for you. And there were enough Jews among the Bolsheviks at some point to make philo-Semitism an official policy of it. And it's one of the first things they did when they took power, is to outlaw what they called anti-Semitism. And if you were a known anti-Semite, you better run, because they were coming after you. If they were going to bring the war to you. So, for example, one of the saddest things I remember reading in 200 Years Together was the epilogue to the Bellis trial. Now, the Bellis trial, mainstream authors will try to tell you that the Bellis trial was a classic example of anti-Semitism, where you have this guy Bellis, or Bielis, I don't know how to pronounce his name. He worked at a Jewish-owned factory. I don't exactly remember where. Maybe it was in modern day Belarus. I'm not sure exactly where, but it was in Russian Empire a few years before World War I. And there was a horrific murder that took place of a young boy, and he was tortured. He was mutilated. They cut him. Whoever murdered him cut him and let him bleed all over the place. It was just really a frightening thing. It wasn't just like two drunk guys getting in a fight. It was, a deliberate murder on the level of Jack the Ripper, where somebody who actually understands anatomy took this kid apart, tortured him, and killed him. Young kid, okay? And of course, the surrounding community was outraged, and there were claims of ritual murder. And then, of course, the Jews were the Jewish community. The people there were very nervous because this was a crime that could very easily be pinned on Jews because it coincided with a lot of stereotypes. And eventually, the prosecutors found this guy Bellis. They thought was Menachem Bellis, I think his name was, and they found him and accused him of the crime. And there was a very famous trial. It was covered everywhere, and basically he was acquitted. And Solzhenitsyn recognizes that the prosecution wasn't their case was never very strong. There were a lot of errors made by the police and stuff, and the case against him wasn't great. And odds are Bellis was perfectly innocent, but we don't, you don't know for sure, but odds are he probably was very innocent. And the peasants who made up the Russian peasants or Ukrainian peasants who made up the jury agreed, and they said, okay, we're going to acquit this guy. So he was acquitted, right? And I mean, that doesn't, whether he was found guilty or innocent doesn't matter. The Jews are very angry as a result of this, calling this anti-Semitism, blah, blah, blah. And anybody who will read books about anti-Semitism that are written by Jewish authors, they're gonna learn about the Bellis trial. But what the Jewish authors will not tell you is what happened afterwards, after the Soviets took control. They hunted down the Minister of the Interior, who was in charge of the trial, and they killed him. They or executed him, I should say. They also found the prosecutor and sent him off to a gulag. So we don't know. I mean, no trial at all. Just send him off. And then they found and this is a regiment of the NKVD or a group of the NKVD that's explicitly Jewish. So these were all Jews in the NKVD. They found a witness for the prosecution, this woman, and they tried to get her to admit that she had been bribed and that her testimony was false, and she wouldn't do it. And so they just shot her. Now, no trial for any of those people. But Bellis gets the trial, and yeah, we're the bad guys. Go figure.
There's a sense of vengeance, an underlying current of hatred, and that manifests itself at moments when they have power, such as these Bolshevik revolutions. Same thing happened in Hungary. They immediately introduced policies that destroyed Christian values, that destroyed the traditional family, that hunted down anyone who was a threat to them. If you read Cecil Tormoy's book, where you had these street thugs beat up wounded veterans that were coming back from the war, just as a message to everyone else. There was this terror whenever you see these manifestations occur. And the big issue for me, and I think for a lot of people, is there's no objective review. There's no objective analysis of what happened. There's this denial, this taboo that's been created. You can't talk about it. If you do talk about it, then you get that scarlet letter of that big R on your forehead. And that translates to the world that we're living in today, where, like you said, the most egregious accusation someone can throw at you is to be a racist. It's a silly argument, but it's not a silly methodology to control you. I should also mention the atrocities that were committed by the Red Army at the end of World War II, where you had murders, rapes. People were just randomly picked off the street, sent to Siberia. You had entire...
Can I add one thing?
Yes.
Can I add one thing to that that's not very well known? And Solzhenitsyn discusses this in his Warning to the West lectures, and I have a chapter on that in my book. And that is the Western Allies, Churchill, Truman, or Roosevelt, betrayed maybe 250,000 Russian emigres who fled the Soviet Union, and they may or may not have worked with the Nazis to fight the Soviets, but in many cases they didn't. They had just fled the Soviet Union, and they were living in Europe, and Stalin wanted them back, and we capitulated to that and gave them back to them and led these people back without telling them what was going to happen, and they were all killed or gulagged. So that's an atrocity level right there. That's at least a couple 100,000 people that nobody talks about. You're not going to go into history books and or mainstream history books or textbooks or whatever, and see that. And Solzhenitsyn brings this up on a couple of occasions. This is something that everyone should be aware of. I mean, like, kids today will know more about the Trail of Tears, where, you know, how many people died in the Trail of Tears? I mean, it's less than 20,000. I'm not going to justify the Trail of Tears or anything because I don't know enough about it, but compared to that, what happened to these Russian emigres was far, far worse, and yet we don't hear anything about that. And that, to me, speaks of a pointed partisan agenda behind our education system, where some atrocities are worth more than others, some are worse than others, and some atrocities don't even deserve a mention. So that the one thing I like to bring up a lot is the comment that Jean-Marie Le Pen once made about the Jewish Holocaust, saying that it was a mere detail in the history of the Second World War. And that, of course, offended Jews and mainstream liberals everywhere. Yet, when you look at the writings of many Jewish authors, they're not going to discuss similar atrocities at all. They're not going to discuss the terror famines. They're not going to discuss what happened to those Russian emigres. So, I mean, and if they do, they'll just drop a mention of it, and they won't really go any further. So that's a detail as well. You see, I mean, that's something that we need to point out on our side. And this is one of the reasons why I wrote my book, is to arm people on the right, identitarians, especially white identitarians, but people on the right in general, against these arguments of the left, where if they bring up certain points, well, we can bring up our own too.
There's countless examples of this. You had a German ethnic community in what is now Slovenia. They were called the Gottscheer Germans. And this community, maybe about 15 to 20 villages in southwest Slovenia, they fled the communists. They went to Germany and Austria, and the Allies sent them back, women and children. God. And
that.
And the entire community, whoever couldn't flee and it was a mass murder, and nobody ever talks about it. And
I know. It seems like if you were of German extraction anywhere in Europe outside of Germany, then your rights just didn't matter. Recently, I read a book called The Mousetrap by Ruth Eigner. And it's a memoir about her time as a young girl immediately post World War II, living in Czechoslovakia, and what the Germans had to endure, which included slavery. Mm-hmm. Okay, no joke, slavery. This woman and her mother were actually sold as slaves to a Czechoslovakian family at one point. She managed to escape by the hair of her chinny chin chin. She got out, but I mean, she was lucky. Most people didn't, and a lot of these people didn't know about what was going to meet them in their fate. Now, I can understand after war, bad things are going to happen. There's going to be resentment, and the Czechs were, they had their own beefs against the Germans, and it goes back and forth. And I'm not going to be demonizing the Czechs, but at the same time, the story of this anti-German oppression doesn't get told. Whereas what Germans did to the Czechs prior to the war or during the war, that gets trumpeted. Okay, but what happened afterwards, where the Germans are actually being victimized and put into slavery, we ignore that. You see, so it's not. I'm talking more about, I guess, historiography than history. I'm talking about the way we teach it and how there's an agenda behind it. And so, again, some atrocities are worth talking about, and others are best kept under the rug.
The Hungarians suffered tremendously as well under the advance of the Soviet Red Army. I have personal experience with this in my family. My great-grandmother was mowed down by Soviet soldiers when she was coming out from church. They were drunk. They were just walking. This is the story that I heard from my family. My maternal grandfather's brother had a wedding, and the Soviet soldiers barged into the wedding, and they raped his wife, and they beat him to a pulp. And you have stories like this all over all over Hungary. You had children. One of my best friend's father was playing in a field, and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the Soviets grabbed him as maybe he was in his early teens. They grabbed him and they took him to Siberia for some trumped up charge for no reason. You had an entire intellectual class, the administrative class, the priestly class, were all decimated and replaced with party loyalists. You had a tremendous amount of fear. You even had groups of Soviet female soldiers roaming the streets of Budapest looking for men to rape. I kid you not. This is exactly what happened. You don't want that to happen to you. That's a horrific experience for anyone.
You also have to remember that the Soviets during World War II would pin atrocities on the Nazis that the Nazis did not commit. So the famous example is the Katyn Forest, where they murdered, and it's a murder. I mean, they invaded Poland, and I think Poland capitulated to them, and they murdered 13,000 Polish officers. For, no reason at all. They just shot them. And then they buried them in the Katyn Forest and tried to pin it on the Nazis. And the Nazis were completely innocent of that. And that's why any Soviet sources of Nazi atrocities committed during World War II, I have to be suspicious of, because these people are liars. Yeah. And they're proven liars. And so if they're going to go and, uncover a camp where, look how many Jews or gypsies were killed, and look how horrible the Nazis are. Yeah, well, look who has everything to gain by demonizing the Nazis. I mean, these are the people that didn't even want the Nuremberg trials to happen. They just wanted to slaughter all the Nazis, just kill them without trial, and then explain later why you had to do so. And that's what they wanted to do. Whereas people in the West wanted to have a trial, and they're like, that's ridiculous. We don't do trials in the Soviet Union, you know. And so, these people are just liars, and so any source they have must be considered suspect when it comes to any kind of anti-nationalist or anti-fascist or anti-German, anti-Nazi propaganda.
People don't realize the amount of ethnic cleansing that occurred during this time as well. You have a tremendous amount of untold tragedies that our people have to contextualize. We have to understand. And when somebody says, well, I'm French, I'm English, I'm American, this isn't my argument. Well, now it is. And I'll tell you why it is. Because the last 50 to 60 years was about perpetuating this myth. This was a myth where you had two sides competing for the virtue of defeating the evil nationalists. You had the Western liberal argument that said we liberated Europe from these evil nationalists, and then you had the Soviet argument that said we liberated Europe from these evil nationalists. And what's sad about it is that both in Russia today and in the West today, this myth continues to become a foundational narrative for both of these sides. Neither side is willing to accept their own responsibility in destroying Europe, because that's really what this led to. It neutered Germany, and in a way it was a form of self-immolation where you saw the British Empire implode after the war. All of this is due to the fact that they're not willing, they're just stubbornly not willing to understand that we have to take an objective look at this, and we have to look at what happened to us, not just as Germans, Hungarians, and Poles, but as Europeans in general. How did this affect Americans in the way they think about themselves? And I think these are very important questions. So to circle back to the question of how we can use examples from literature to reconcile this persistent false mythology, I think that reading Solzhenitsyn is very important. Reading dissident writers from anywhere, whether it's from Poland, whether it's from Hungary, whether it's from any part of that world that experienced these horrors, I think that should be an important lesson for us to understand that. And again, we have to be very careful on the source. Just being dissident and anti-communist is not enough. You have to look at who this dissident writer is. What does this dissident writer represent? Are they representing a core identity of their nation, of their people, of their tradition? Or are they representing a competing ideology to communism? And you have to make a distinction between the two. In the Hungarian example, you'll have, like I mentioned before, János Pilinszky. He was a Catholic. He was a great poet. He approached these questions through that point of view, and that was an organic reality for the Hungarians. Whereas you had someone like Faludi, who was another poet who in my view is an absolute degenerate. And he made the argument from the liberal point of view. When I'm identifying, I'm not just going to say blanket statement, any anti-communist is someone I want to use as an example. I have to be more discriminating when it comes to who it is that I would like to use as an example to reconcile this persistent false mythology that's been created. So let's go to the last question. And this ties into everything that we've been talking about. What advice would you give our artists in both effectively identifying and countering current threats from the left? How can we decipher leftist literature to understand the real motives behind these works?
First of all, I can really only speak to fiction writers. I can't, I don't do any other kind of art, so I can't talk about painting or talk about any other music or whatever. But when it comes to people who write fiction, what I can say is you have to ask yourself a question. Is it better to create good art that is not political than to create bad art that is? So some people will write stories or novels and they think that, well, if I fill it with enough red-pilled observations, it's going to be good because I'm telling the truth, But really what you get is tedium. You get stories that will fall flat, especially for people who are not part of the choir. If you don't have technique and practice and experience, and you just say, well, I'm going to write a story about somebody getting red-pilled, and I'm going to have all these, I'm going to talk about race, I'm going to talk about Jews, I'm going to talk about this and that, you could do much better writing a manifesto than you can than in writing a story. It reminds me of I think it was John Cleese watched the movie Brazil when it came out in the early 80s or whenever it was, and I think a member of Monty Python wrote and directed that movie. I forget which one, I think the American one. And he asked Cleese, what'd you think of the movie? And Cleese said, well, he said something to the effect that your movie tells me that corruption and hypocrisy is bad and oppression is bad, and I already knew that, and so that is the biggest slam you could give any kind of work of narrative, fiction. So I think that if you're a dissident, or if you're, you're an artist, or I should say a novel writer or short story, and you want to create something that is good for our cause, I think the first thing you would have to do is master prose. That means character. That means plot. Typically, I mean, this is my opinion. You can take it with a grain of salt, but that's what I like. And I think I'm on good ground here, although there's probably room for some controversy. And it might be a good idea if you're starting, to write stories that have no obvious political agenda. Just so you can get the experience of writing without being burdened by a political agenda or political ideas. Just write what you know, write the characters you know, write the story you know, and write in readable, clear prose that serves your story. You do that a couple times, then maybe as you mature as an author, as an artist, then you can start saying, okay, well, I'm going to put, I'm going to have this kind of agenda, or I should say, not even really an agenda, but a perspective. So, for example, Growth of the Soil by Knut Hamsun that I mentioned earlier, that doesn't have a nationalist or an ethnocentric agenda, but it has a nationalist and an ethnocentric perspective that is positive and undeniable and is beautiful. And that is, to me, the best way to stimulate people on our side of the political divide, and maybe convince people on the opposite side. That to me is the most effective way, rather than just lecturing someone for pages and pages and pages about the virtues of whatever political point you want to make, because that gets old very quickly for people who either know it or for people who don't.
Right. So, tell me in a way that that keeps me interested. And that, by the way,
I mean, I think that the primary goal of a fiction writer, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the primary goal of a fiction writer, in my opinion, is to entertain.
Yes.
If you can't entertain and just make the pages turn on their own accord, if you can't do that, it doesn't matter how right your political opinions are. It doesn't matter how righteous you are. None of that matters. That's all secondary, tertiary. The most important thing is to entertain. And so I would have to say that, I don't know. I mean, any best-selling fantasy novel that is devoid of any kind of political substance, but yet is constructed well enough that makes you want to turn the page, is a superior novel than any heartfelt dissident novel that's filled with red-pilled observations. It's superior because the idea is to entertain first. Second comes the artistic value. Second comes the insights into human nature. Second comes the political aspect of it. You have to master the technique that you create, that you have to perfect as a writer, must lead to entertaining the reader first.
Right.
And then everything else is after that. And therefore people put the cart before the horse and think, well, I just need to, promote a political agenda. And then that makes it a good book. No, it doesn't. It might make it a good manifesto or essay, but not a work of art. So you have to you have to put the horse before the cart, entertain first, and then enlighten second.
Right. And you can select various themes that are inherently a part of our tradition. A good example, you can write a story about a German family that was in Königsberg, for example, after the Second World War, and what their situation is, what they went through. If you write a good story about it without making it overtly political, then you have a great novel there. You can write, you don't have to necessarily incorporate your opinion about anything. Just write it as you do some research. You find out that this family lived in Königsberg somewhere in toward the end of the war, and what they experienced, and maybe how they had to flee to Berlin or wherever, and just make it a great story. And by just doing that, you've already sent a message, because you're addressing a topic that's taboo. But at the same time, you're not making it explicitly political. You're making it just a good story. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Before we end this episode, do you have any last thoughts? Anything you would like to add?
Please buy my book, Solzhenitsyn and the Right, published by Antelope Hill. And the hardcover will be coming out right after Thanksgiving. And I hope you all enjoy it.
Thank you. And please tell the audience where they may be able to find you and your work.
Yes, you just go to Counter Currents. That's counter-currents.com. I try to produce an essay a week. I try to do 4 a month for them, and so you can reach me there. Again, you can buy my novel White Like You from Counter Currents, my children's book My Mirror Tells a Story from the White People Press, Solzhenitsyn and the Right from Antelope Hill, and Charity's Blade from Logik, or otherwise known as the Free Speech Library. I consider that to be the work of fiction that I'm most proud of, but I'm proud of all of them, actually. And I'm working on a new novel right now. Hopefully that will see the light of day next year.
Wonderful. And I read Charity's Blade, and it's a phenomenal book. I strongly recommend it to everyone. I've also read into the Solzhenitsyn on the Right. I haven't completed it, but it's a very well-written book, and I also strongly recommend that you order those as well. Once again, thank you very much for this great conversation. I had a wonderful time speaking with you, and thank you again for sharing your time and your thoughts.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for granting me your time and patience. It is through art that we can achieve the highest standards of decorum and elegance. It is through art that we can move our brothers and sisters to finally awaken. It is through art that we can seek the face of God. I hope all of you and your families stay safe during these precarious times. Focus on what matters. Our people have been through worse, and we will always rise again. Our strength lies in our ability to love and respect each other. Our strength is defined by our ability to set aside our differences and fight alongside each other as sons and daughters of Europa. I will end this episode with a brilliant classical piece by Andrei Moseyev titled Ere Dawn Majestic. I am particularly honored to have Andrei allow me to play 3 pieces this evening. Thank you very much, sir. You can find Andrei's music on YouTube under the same name. Have a good evening.